Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I'm honored to have Dr. Brian McVeigh back, and we're going to be talking about Japan. And it's a very interesting idea. I mean, one of the things that has fascinated me about Japan is that it can change on a dime. It can go from being completely open to the world to being completely closed. It can go between, being extremely aggressive, militaristic, expansionist power to being inward-looking, pacifist country, and all of it can happen like that. It's the speed of that transition which has always fascinated me and puzzled me, and that's the general topic that Brian is going to be talking about. So, Brian, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So what I'm going to talk about today is called Renovationism. And that actually is based on a book here, Nationalisms of Japan, Managing and Mystifying Identity. I wrote this book quite a while back, but I think it still holds some truths about Japan. And in this book, of course, I take renovationism apart as an ideology. So at first, some of what I say, I think, is going to be a little bit abstract. Some of the words, I will try to define those words, but hopefully throughout the talk, what I'm saying, the points I'm trying to make will make more sense. Hopefully they'll become more concrete. So please bear with me. The first two concepts that I want to introduce in order to get at what renovationism actually means is Japaneseness or Japanese identity. What is that? And of course, that's very difficult to pin down. It's very difficult to define. But that's one thing we will be talking about. The other word is modernity or modernization. And modernity, for my purposes today, is really just an abbreviation of a package of a whole bunch of different concepts that came onto the world stage about 150, 200 years ago. And we take modernity for granted, so we don't question it. But to give you an idea of some of the contents of this package of modernity, I'm talking about things like advanced science and technology, Enlightenment ideas about politics, such as democracy, constitutional rights, of course, the Industrial Revolution from the early 19th century, capitalism, open markets, nationalism. And of course, nationalism will be a key part of my talk today. What is the modern way that we view human nature that's been around for the past 100, 200 years? And I'm talking about modern social sciences, political science, economics, sociology, psychology, anthropology. These are the intellectual lenses that we use to try and find out or try to understand what it means to be human. So all those things I just listed, they all constitute what I call modernity. And so what today's talk is about is how Japaneseness, whatever that means, and modernity have interacted. How have they sort of influenced each other in Japan? The next thing I want to clarify is this idea of time. I mean, if we're talking about modernity, we're talking about historical change. And for my purposes, we have to keep in mind that there are two types of time. One time, the first type is just chronological objective time. So we all agree that it's 2021, and we all agree that about 20 years ago, there was the year 2000. That's not in dispute. That's easy to understand. The second type of time we can call imaginary or symbolic time, and that is about how a society or a people interpret dates or how they view the passage of time. So for example, 1868, for Japanese, that means something significant. It probably doesn't mean too much to most Americans, unless you're familiar with American history. 1776 means something to Americans. That has a great symbolic weight. Or if you're French, 1789, the Bastille Day, or the French Revolution. So that's what I mean by imaginary time. So as I'm talking today, we want to keep that distinction in mind. What did certain dates mean for the Japanese, still mean for the Japanese, and how do they view the passage of time, especially as their society began to modernize in the late 19th century? So the next thing I want to do is give a very thumbnail sketch, a definition of renovationism or renovationist nationalism. And as I said, this is a bit abstract, but as I talk, hopefully some of the details will flesh out what I'm trying to argue. So what is renovationism? It has three aspects. And I should also, before I go on, I should also emphasize, my talk today falls within the genre, I suppose, of big history, okay? Or at least looking at the passage of history 2-3 centuries. It's not, I'm not talking about, I'm not focusing in on a particular period, right? So that's why, to warn you, there may be a sort of abstractness to the way I'm presenting today. But in any case, so let's get back to the definition of renovationism. So the first aspect, a keen sensitivity to the intensity of speed from social political changes associated with the 19th century. Okay, so I'll read that again. It's when a people, in this case the Japanese, have a keen sensitivity to the intensity of speed from social, political, economic changes that occurred in the 19th century. The second aspect of renovationism, a great concern with cultural authenticity. And I put authenticity in quotation marks. In other words, what does it mean to be Japanese? All right, so to repeat, a great concern with cultural authenticity, and what does it mean to be Japanese? And then the third aspect of renovationism, concentrated attention on emulating or modeling oneself on powerful national states in order to increase national prestige and power. And in Japan, the phrase that they would use quite often would be catching up with the West, to catch up with the West politically, in terms of economics, in terms of science and technology. How do we catch up with the West? That seems to have driven, I think, a lot of Japanese history. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share something on the screen. So let me put it up and hopefully you can see it. So can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, good. So this is going to be a slideshow. And as I said, it may be a little abstract at first, but hopefully as I give some examples, things will begin to make more sense. So let's just step back, because remember, we're doing big history, and look at the historical context of modern Japanese history. And I think one way to contextualize Japan is with this idea of two types of industrializers since the 19th century or the early 19th century. Okay. Two types of industrializers. How did nations react to the pressure to industrialize? And some were more successful than others, of course. So the first type of industrializer are the ones that we're very familiar with. Great Britain, France, United States, some other European countries. Actually, I think people say the West. I don't think that's a good way to view things when we're talking about early industrializers, because there were some Western countries that tried to industrialize, but had a very difficult time. But in any case, what we're talking about here are changes due to the accumulation of wealth, and how early industrializers were able to stabilize their political systems. Because it doesn't make much difference how much science and technology and how big your economy is if you cannot disseminate the view that everyone is getting a fair shake. So it's not just an economic issue, it's also a political issue. How do you stabilize a political system? And usually in societies such as the United States, Great Britain, France, the idea was to introduce political liberty, a type of constitutionalism, to give people this sense in Western democracies that they were part of this grand plan to build a middle class. And this is based on this idea of what we call political liberty. So I'm going to mention political liberty, liberation. Don't worry too much about that now. We can talk about what I mean by that a bit later. But in any case, I just want to give you an idea of what life was like in these early industrializers. So for the sake of comparison, if we look at places like Russia, China, South and Central America, in these places, modernization, or the attempt to build a stable nationalism, was linked not to the political liberty of the individual so much, but rather to what we might call the proletariat or peasant people's revolution, talking more about a type of liberation. And of course, in places like China, Japan, these dramatic history that they went through, of course, had very little to do with the experiences of the early industrializers, such as Great Britain and the United States. So now let's talk about what we can call the late industrializers. Okay, Germany, Russia, Italy, Japan, these places faced more challenges to catch up to the early industrializers. And if you look at the history, and of course, we're all very familiar with the history, I think, of the Russian Revolution, the Axis powers of Italy, Japan, and Germany. And in these societies, it seems that individual rights were neglected or sacrificed, and collectivist rights were stressed in their attempt to catch up with the early industrializers. So Japan, of course, we're talking mid-19th century, when there was pressure on Japan to open up. And of course, from the point of view of the Japanese, their mission was to protect themselves against, for lack of a better term, the Western powers, namely United States, France, Great Britain, actually also the Russian Empire at that time, because this was an era of expansionist nationalism. And eventually in Japan, their reaction to this pressure to catch up while maintaining their freedom from Western powers was to blur wartime and peacetime mobilization. And this would last up until around 1950 in the case of Japan. So, my presentation today is not chronological, so I'm going to skip ahead to make some points. So right now, if you look at Japan's present day position, it's really on a geopolitical fault line between China and the United States. And of course, not that long ago, the other great communist power, the Soviet Union. And of course, even today, even though Russia is not a communist power officially, Japan feels sort of stuck between these great powers, stuck between the United States and its anti-communist military efforts, and then what used to be communist Soviet Union, and then China, and we might as well throw in North Korea. So I'm bringing up this point now to kind of impart a sense of how the leadership in Tokyo views their place in the world. And they view their place right now as being a precarious situation. This idea that they're surrounded by enemies. That was more true during the height of the Cold War. It certainly was true going back to the late 19th century, and I still think it's true today. And also remember that after 1945, officially, Japan was pacifist. They had the so-called Pacifist Constitution. They did not like to say that they had an army or a military. They still say they have a self-defense force. But the reality is that Japan, whether you think it was a good thing or a bad thing, whatever your politics are, Japan was very much a component in the American projects, the US Cold War projects. And in fact, not that long ago, some leaders in Japan, especially those on the right, were not happy with their position vis-a-vis the United States, and they would describe themselves as being too much under the control of the United States. I'm talking about more right-wing political leadership in Japan, not mainstream. And they would sometimes use the term semi-sovereign state, that they really don't have that much power. And I mention this to give you an idea of how does this feed into this notion of renovationism, where renovationism is all about catching up, and it's about this fear that you're not renovating fast enough, that you're not building up your military economic power fast enough. And I think that this ideology still motivates the political leadership in Japan. So to go back in history, again, to give this idea, Japan, it's worth noting that Japan was engaged in hostilities during nearly half of the years from 1894 to 1945. So remember, Japan started to open up, we'll say around in the 1860s, and they basically went on a crash course of modernization. And I think because they went on this crash course of modernization, they always felt, and they still feel, I think some Japanese, that they lost something, that they were losing their Japaneseness, whatever that means, that their Japanese cultural identity was under threat. But in any case, so if we look at the history here, so the Japanese fought the Chinese 1894 to 95. They were successful, which in the Japanese mind at the time, that was an intellectual earthquake, because you have to remember, for about 2,000 years, 1,500 years probably to be more accurate, the Japanese would look to China as the global leader in all fields. And the idea, it's a strange way to put it, but the Japanese were the little brother to China. China, in that part of the world especially, it was a Sinocentric world. And the idea that this small country could militarily defeat China really sent shockwaves, not just in Asia, but throughout the world. So that was, in a way, a historic turning point, that war. That was a war where Japan really came into its own as a modern military power. And then, of course, we have the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905. This war, I think, and of course, the Japanese won this war. This war was even a bigger intellectual earthquake on the global scale. And we have to go back in time and remember that during this period, racism, we think racism is bad today, but at that time, racism really dominated the way people looked at everything, including global international relations. And so the idea, as we know, there was a pyramid of white Christian races that dominated what today we would call people of color, that would dominate in what were considered inferior civilizations, including the Chinese and the Japanese. But the Japanese really upturned this. They defeated a white Christian empire. So it's difficult perhaps today to imagine what big news that was, but that was, again, a historic turning point. And now the powers at that time, the American power, the Americans, the British, the French, the Germans, really started to recognize And in fact, they celebrated the Japanese victory at the time, because some of them did not have good relations with the Russian Empire anyways. So then to move on to World War I, 1914, 1918, of course, the Japanese were on the side of the victors in that war. And then what is called by some people the 15 Years' War, or the Pacific War, 1931, 1945. And of course, we know that Japan was defeated in that war. What's important to keep in mind, this idea, that because it relates to mass mobilization, whether Japan was at war or not, the state was always coming up with projects to mobilize the people. And even after the war, right, there's this idea of post-war management. Japan can no longer be a military power, but it's going to be an economic power. And so how does this play into this ideology of being able to quickly turn things around, change gears, and rebuild Japan as at least a regional, if not a global power? And of course, tensions, this tension of trying to balance modernity with Japaneseness, the tensions created by that struggle has continued, I think, into the post-imperial period. So these are just some pictures, some graphics of the Russo-Japanese War. As you can see, the Russo-Japanese War in large part was fought over control of Korea. So again, I've already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, to try and look at things from the point of view of the Japanese, since the late 19th century to the present, there's this sense that they have to be free, they have to be liberated from Western imperialism and colonialism and foreign economic control and exploitation. That may not be so true today, but in fact, it's not true today. But certainly in the late 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, it was true, because the Western powers, of course, had carved up Africa. They were eating away at the Ottoman Empire, parts of the Middle East. The British had control of India and other parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia. China was parts of China, not all of China, but parts of China had been taken over and occupied by Western powers. So this was very real. There was nothing academic about the way the Japanese viewed the world at that time. So this idea of renovationism, this slide here actually has to do, I think, with the notion of modern nationalism. And nationalism, the way we think of it, is it's a new ideology, maybe 100, 150 years old, depending on what parts of the world you look at. Before that time, most people lived under empires. And what's important about nationalism is bringing the elitist elements together with the more popular elements. You know, because under an empire, the idea is that it's stratified, and at the peak, the nobility, the aristocrats who ran the empire would have more in common with aristocrats or leaders from other empires than they would with their own people. But nationalism changed that. And so it's important to see how this played out in Japan. And so the idea, beginning in the late 19th century, the Japanese came up with a lot of official plans. And the idea was to bridge the divide between what we might call a populist energy and official goals. And so beginning in the late 19th century in Japan, this new ideology of nationalism was reflected in a lot of discussions of national pride, patriotic pride, and middle-class aspirations, building a middle class, which I think actually is a key component of modernity. And to give you an example from Japan, in the early 1960s, the state, in an attempt to unite everybody, because remember, Japan was still rebuilding after the war, the state elite came up with this, what they called income doubling plan of the early 1960s. And actually, they went beyond their expectations. And this, again, this is one of these achievements of Japan that is often forgotten. So this slide is just sort of reiterating something I already said, that this idea of official-led, state-guided mobilization during extraordinary times, during national emergencies, and of course, when you have to militarize during wartime. But what's interesting about Japan is I think even after the war, there was this blurring between daily life and a sense of being in a national emergency. So after the war in Japan, it was not so much about a sort of militarist mobilization. It was more about an economic mobilization, a type of what some people call economic nationalism. And of course, all modern national states have a degree of economic nationalism, but in any case, it's very easy to see examples of economic nationalism in the case of Japan. And this relates to this idea of renovationism. How can we keep Japan strong? How can we build up Japan in the face of foreign threats, whether those threats are militaristic or economic? So just to go back in history a bit, just some examples of what we can call mundane mobilization during ordinary times at the everyday level. And the idea is to help or to liberate the people in the 1920s and 30s in Japan. So some examples. Again, we take this for granted, right? But we're going back over 100 years. And a lot of these projects, a lot of these attempts by the elite to mobilize society were considered novel at the time and considered quite revolutionary. So they would organize society into small units in schools and the workplace to increase not just their educational goals, but also goals of productivity, savings campaigns to get people to save money, to not splurge, hygiene campaigns to make sure that the standards between the urban and the rural areas when it came to things like hygiene were on par, public safety campaigns, and then what is called in Japan moral education. How do you make good Japanese citizens or good Japanese subjects? Because after all, they were in an empire under the emperor at that time. And by the way, moral education, when I was in Japan, all students had to take a course on moral education. And I'm pretty sure, I don't study Japanese education anymore, but I would guess that they still have to take a class on moral education. So you can see this fascinating continuity from the imperial period into the post-war period. That's a whole nother talk, actually, what moral education is about in Japan. So now, as I said, I'm sorry, I'm sort of skipping back here historically, but let's go back to one of the most important dates in modern Japanese history, the Meiji Restoration. And this was really the first Renovationist Nationalist event. And for those of you who are familiar with Japanese history, you'll know that what happened is this feudal military shogunate was overthrown and the emperor was restored to power. It's kind of an odd way to look at history for a number of reasons. For one thing, after the empire was, quote, restored to power, he still did not have that much power. There's a question of whether he's really, there's a question if he ever had power throughout Japanese history. So there's a lot of propaganda and ideology here. This is a whole nother topic. But in any case, remember, before 1868, the person who ruled Japan, who had real power, of course, was the shogun. And the shogun was a type of general. And in theory, he was supposed to be working for the emperor. But in fact, the emperor, I think, worked for the shogun. The emperor, throughout Japanese history, was not so much a political leader, but was more something like the Pope, I think, in the Catholic Church, had more of a religious meaning. So this idea of restoration, as I just pointed out, it's kind of questionable. I think it's, as I write here, it's an inadequate translation of a word, ishin. It does not correspond to monarchical restorations of Europe. And I think the Japanese in the late 19th century, when they were trying to modernize, they would look to Europe and borrow these ideas, such as restoration. We have to be we have to fit our template of history into what these advanced Europeans are doing. So let's say that we had a restoration, when in fact it was, that's not exactly a good translation. And so what does this restoration, the Meiji Ishin, mean exactly? Well, it was not a coup d'etat. It did involve radical change, a rupture with Japan's past. And by that, I mean they would start to introduce technology, science. They would debate the best way to have a modern political system. Should it be democratic? Should it be socialist? Should it just be a traditional monarchy? You know, what type of political system should we have? But this was not just a restructuring of the polity. As I said, it was really a revolution in Japan. But it was not, usually when we think of revolution, we think of it from the people up, from the bottom up. But many historians like to say that the Meiji Restoration was a revolution from the top down. It was led by the elites. That's not completely true, but I think it's not a bad place to look at, a bad way to look at things. So this so-called revolution, it had economic aspects, it's educational. It was intended to mobilize the people so that Japan could renovate itself, so it could acquire wealth, strength, and most important, national independence. And so that's why I put that idea there of liberation. Okay, so this slide is a little bit much, but please bear with me. So this goes back to these two words that I introduced at the beginning of my talk, Japaneseness and modernity. And what do they, how do they interrelate? Because their interaction really is what renovationism is all about. So let's start with number one. Japan, there's a perception among Japanese, especially the Japanese elite, that they do not feel powerful or modern enough because they're being threatened, and they were threatened by imperialist powers. And there's this idea of the degraded present. So this goes back to, I talked about symbolic imaginary time. So at that time, for the Japanese elite, they felt that they had lost something. So to defend itself, Japan needs to become more modern and powerful. And it does this by emulating foreign powers, by absorbing their technologies and institutions. So they would adopt these models from foreign lands, but the adaptation, the adoption would cause a perception among the Japanese that their identity was being threatened and that they would not be able to return to their glorious past before they encountered the modern, fast-paced world. And so consequently, they would attempt to renovate or to radically and quickly rebuild Japan. And they would pursue this idea. It's sort of a nebulous, amorphous idea of Japaneseness. What is Japaneseness anyways, right? Depends who you ask. But in any case, they would restore and make Japan stronger. And they would aim at a modernity, a sort of utopian future. And of course, when we say modernity in this context, we're talking about modern ideologies of capitalism, imperialism, nationalism, science and technology. But then what happens is, again, this is a circular logic, if you will. Japan, the Japanese elite, they perceive themselves to be not modern or powerful enough. So then the cycle starts again. And so what happens is you have Japaneseness and modernity in this self-reinforcing dynamic. And I think this dynamic maybe has slowed down a bit, but I think it's still there if you look at what's been going on in Japan lately. So just a couple more slides. So let me talk about reforms. People, when I first wrote this book, people would say, I don't understand what's so different about reforms. I mean, all modern national states have to go through reforms. And isn't that the same as renovationism? Well, of course, it is to a degree. But I think, at least when I lived in Japan, all they talked about was reform. Everything had to be reformed. whether it was political restructuring, enhancing economic productivity, improving the financial system, fixing the educational system. And I worked in Japanese higher education for many years, and I saw firsthand this sort of obsession with in trying to change and improve their education system. So this focus on reform, I think, continues this renovationist ideology. And also I should add, I think many foreign observers and commentators, they misinterpret what reform means in the post-imperial Japanese context. Reform in Japan, and this is I think this is a simplification. It's a bit unfair, perhaps. I think it's more subtle, more complex than I'm portraying it. But just to make the point, when they talk about reform in Japan, it's about how to make official institutions, large corporations, and and the state elite more powerful. So even when they would talk about deregulation, the idea is how to make the state more efficient, thereby making the state more powerful. And for example, bureaucratic streamlining, or to reorganize all their ministries. Of course, that's done to make the state more powerful, not to give more freedom to individuals necessarily. So when I was in Japan, one of my projects, a lot of the writing I had to do was to learn about the ministries, especially the Ministry of Education. I spent a lot of time studying the Ministry of Education, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand how Japanese bureaucracy works. And I sort of, and then I was disappointed because one year they decided to rearrange all the ministries and give them different names and everything else. And so all this work and research that I had done sort of became outdated very quickly. But nevertheless, I think the ideology is still the same, this idea of constant renovation and reform. So, as I said, by making the state stronger, it's easier to keep free from foreign domination, whether we're talking about in the late 19th century, in the face of Western imperialist expansion, or whether we're talking about North Korea and China in the current day. And I think also economically. So, you know, in Japan, they view, since the war especially, and this is not a surprise to any of us, they view power in a very economic sense. In any case, the last line in this slide is very important. This idea about what does reform mean from the Japanese perspective, this idea of renovationism. And a mistake that I would see many, especially North American researchers make, is they thought that reform meant introducing Anglo-American liberalism or more individual rights, a sort of political liberty into the system. But when I was in Japan, I didn't see that. Now, don't get me wrong, Japan is a democracy, and it's actually one of the more stable democracies on the world scene today. In fact, in many ways, I think it's more democratic than the United States. So I'm not saying Japan is not democratic. I'm not saying individual rights do not matter. I'm just saying if we want a more nuanced understanding of what's going on in Japan, we have to take this history into account, and we have to remember that there's this ideology of renovationism that inspires a lot of the changes in Japan. And I want to end on just one point I want to make. So this idea of renovationism, it does not apply just to Japan. This idea of renovationism applies to something that I talked about at the beginning of my talk, the distinction between late and early industrializers. So renovationism, you see this ideology being played out in China, in Russia, in Turkey, you know, this idea of going back to the glories of the Ottoman Empire, certain parts of the Middle East, in India. So this idea of renovationism, this is not just about Japan. This, I think, puts in perspective how certain societies have contended with the very disruptive forces of modernity. So I think maybe I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Brian, that was a lot of ground. That was a lot of ground. And not just about Japan, but this is an issue that I think every country has faced. I mean, the most fascinating thing for me is that I was hearing you talk about Japan adjusting to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. If you look at the world today, there is a tremendous revolution going on, the digital revolution, which is probably of the same scale as the Industrial Revolution. And countries are struggling to adjust to that. And my guess is that they are using similar strategies that they have used in the past. And there is all kinds of variations in the way in which different countries are doing it. So it's a really, really fascinating topic. So I want to, instead of going to the breakout rooms, I would like to give a chance for people to ask questions. So let me try, I'll start by asking a couple of questions and then we'll open it up. So folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type an exclamation mark in chat. Try to keep your questions brief. If you can, just write down your questions so it is very targeted. We want to cover as much ground as possible. Okay, so try to keep your question brief. All right. So I see there are two factors, right? There is one penchant for being modern and being effective and being powerful using the modern technology. So there is that one impetus. And second, there is a drive towards, I think you use the word authenticity of saying that I want to be truly Japanese. I want to be truly a certain way. And that's kind of looking back at your heritage and saying, I want to preserve that. So looks like that's the tension.
Yes.
And everything else is just kind of ways of making that happen, or movement between kind of saying, okay, this is the degraded present. So our current people do not have the requisite modern grasp of the modern technology, use of the modern technology. So it's a degraded present. There is a glorious past because that had the authenticity that we want. So everything seems to be defined in terms of this authenticity versus effective use of modern technology. So something like that. Right. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
Yes, it is. And what's important to keep in mind is that this modernity and the search for Japanese authenticity are locked in a dynamic. Yes. And the more you do one, it increases the other. And it's a self-reinforcing feedback.
You mean increases? That means it goes away from the ideal? You're saying that when you push towards modernity, the Japaneseness goes down?
No, it increases.
Okay.
So what happens is they feel that they're modernizing too fast and they're losing their Japaneseness. So they want their Japaneseness to come back. But ironically, the tools they use to increase their authenticity have to be modern. Mm-hmm. Have to be things like modern social media or technology or capitalism, or to have a strong military to defend Japan. Mm-hmm. And then the more modern they become, they feel they're losing their Japaneseness. And so it goes around and around. So that's what I mean when I say it's a circular, self-reinforcing logic.
Excellent. All right, folks. So let's go to questions from the audience. It's going to be Claudio followed by Tom. Claudio, what's your question?
Oh, thank you for the great presentation to both of you, Shrikant and Brian. The question is, Japan has an historical tendency to strengthen their export industry and import less goods and services and export a lot more. Compared to other nations like America. Now, is that motivated mainly by their desire to retain their Japanese identity, keep Japan a homogeneous country, or B, have expansionist tendency to maybe, particularly in the regions of Southeast Asia, to rule those countries through trade, like imperialistic tendencies, or C, to keep up with America, retain its strength and make it more powerful? Which one is more, A, B, or C?
Just very briefly, if you could. So, what was A? Just 2 or 3 words.
Well, I'm sorry. To retain their Japanese identity, keep the
Okay.
country more homogenous, right?
Right.
Uh,
All right. And so, well, to answer your question, I think they all play a role, and I think it depends on who in Japan you ask. I mean, if you ask somebody working for a multinational corporation, they're going to tell you that it has to do with economic expansionism. If you ask somebody somebody on the street, a Japanese person who is very proud of their ethnic culture, they'll tell you that it has to do with protecting and maintaining their identity. There's no one right answer. I think I think they all play a role. It just depends what sector of the Japanese system, if I can use that word, you ask.
Next up is going to be Tom, followed by Kevin. Tom.
Okay, so I'm interested in the distribution of power from emperor down to citizen for actually making change. And I assume it changed through time, but how much real power did people have in the ministries and in other sectors to make change?
Well, so I'm going to assume that you mean in current day Japan. Is that correct?
No, I'm actually interested in history. We can start with current day Japan, but is there a radical change in it going back, 50 years in the power distribution for change?
Yes, I think after the war, I think Japan did embrace democracy. Of course, they have a monarchy. Officially, they're a constitutional monarchy like Great Britain. They rewrote their constitution. That they had a new post-war constitution, and I do think if you want to look at things in a comparative perspective, compared to most of Europe, for example, the average Japanese is free. There is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. I think their democracy is not as freewheeling as American democracy. I think American democracy is well, I don't want to get into too much, but I don't think America is necessarily as democratic as Americans might think. Actually, it really depends on what you're looking at. So there, after the war, that was a turning point. I mean, before the war, during the imperial period, of course, in theory, the emperor had the most power. In reality, it was the military dictatorship and the ministries who had the power. But certainly after the war, beginning in the 50s, Japan did become a type of liberal democracy.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin, followed by Katie. Kevin.
My question is, from your observation, Brian, does the Empire of Japan have any power? Why they, after World War II, they still keep an empire? The second question is, during the World War II, the Japan ambition is to build the code, I think the link below, Great Eastern Asia co-prosperity sphere, which right. Not include in China, India, and then even Middle East, even Russia. So what's the research about that? Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So in modern times, if you look at a map of Japan, its boundaries have expanded and then contracted. And of course, when it was an empire, it did try to build in the 1930s and early 40s what they call a co-prosperity sphere. Basically, it was an empire where they controlled Korea, parts of China, Southeast Asia. So your first question is, do they still want to keep an empire? I mean, I think it's obvious that they're more interested in economic power than they are military power. But at the same time, I think the Japanese should not be underestimated. And I think perhaps the North Koreans and the Chinese are maybe underestimating Japan, because I think that the Japanese will defend themselves militarily. I don't think that I don't think they're assertive or aggressive now, but I can see fireworks starting quite easily if Beijing or North Korea misinterprets what used to be called Japan's pacifism.
Thank you. Next up is Katie. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about this idea of it's the neighborhood that it's in. Like North Korea is there, China's there, like a lot of the countries around them are not democracies, and how that plays into their perception of exceptionalism. Because Europe is far away. They're catching up with the West and a lot of the democratization that happened earlier. But I just would like to hear like how their neighborhood affects their perception of themselves.
Yes, that's an important question. I think one thing I would say is that from the Japanese perspective, they view themselves as the first East Asian society to successfully modernize, industrialize. And in fact, some people would say that Japan was the earliest non-Western industrializer. Of course, it was a very bloody period, a very bloody way to modernize your society, what the Japanese tried to do. But yes, I mean, in that neighborhood, it's clear you have places like the People's Republic of China and North Korea that do not seem democratic at all. But there are other democracies, other flourishing democracies, of course. Taiwan, but of course the Taiwanese consider themselves to be rulers of all of China, so it's a little bit complicated. But South Korea, since the 1980s, South Korea is a strong democracy. And in Southeast Asia, it's a little more mixed, I think. It depends what country you look at. South Korea is an interesting place. South Korea, when their presidents do something wrong, they put them in jail. And, some people might say that's a good sign of democracy. If you can put the most powerful person in your society in prison, assuming they did something wrong, that means democracy is working. But in any case, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that was wonderful.
Wonderful. So I'll ask one last question and then we'll go to breakout rooms. What has been the dynamic between China and Japan through this time? Because compared to everything, all other neighbors, China is the overwhelming neighbor. So what has been the dynamic between Japan and China?
So you mean currently?
Not currently, historically.
Okay. Well, yeah, so that's an interesting question because historically, of course, China was the center of that part of the world. It was a very Sino-centric world. And all these other civilizations and societies that were on the periphery of China had to pay tribute to China. They were called moonlight civilizations. And Japan fit into that category. And so, as I said before, it was a real shock when the Japanese defeated the Chinese in the late 19th century. And of course, the Japanese, as we know, they invaded China in the 1930s, committed a lot of atrocities. And this has that history, of course, still plays a big role in the tense relationship between Tokyo and Beijing. There's a tremendous amount of economic competition between Japan and China, of course. But the one that is more concerning, I think, is the military tensions between Japan and China. And what's going to happen, where that's going to lead, of course, I don't know. But as I said before, I think when I was in China, when I was in Japan, people would get upset if you brought up the fact that Japan might have to defend itself against North Korea or defend itself against China. That was taboo. You weren't supposed to say that. That was almost insulting to their pacifist worldview. And you know, the students I taught were Japanese students were very, very quiet. It was very difficult to get them to say anything. But when I brought up, you know, well, maybe Japan should change its pacifist ways, oh boy, all the hands went up, and all of a sudden they were very outspoken, and they would tell me that, no, you know, Sensei, McVeigh Sensei, you're mistaken, that no, Japan has no enemies in the world. And I had a hard time explaining to them that, look, that's propaganda, that you may be nice people and Japan may not want to pick a fight. But the truth of the matter is there are other national states in your neighborhood very close that have a problem with you.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. All right. So we're going to do breakout rooms for only 20 minutes to discuss these ideas. And then when you come back, you'll get one more chance to ask questions or give your takeaways.
Okay. We really had two questions, but I'll stick with one. We're not sure how the role of women is changing in Japan, and how that would kind of assume it must be, and how that would alter their political actions, their political directions, and whether that would make them more part of global modernization than they would otherwise be.
Brian, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a big question. That's an important question. So there's a lot of discussion about the role of women in Japan. There's actually always been a discussion, I think, historically in modern times about the role of women in Japan. I recently read somewhere in the Economist a comparison of, I think it was maybe 125 countries, and how women do politically and how they do economically. For example, do they sit on corporate boards, and how many women are elected to major office? And Japan was ranked very, very low. It was actually, I was surprised. Japan was ranked very, very low. So I guess what I would say is, when it comes to women, Japan has a long ways to go. I mean, when I was in Japan, when I would talk to women about this, you know, I'm not saying all Japanese women thought this, but they would say to me, this sounds sexist, you know, but they would say, I'm happy being a housewife. That's what I was brought up to do. I don't mind working part-time. I don't want a lot of responsibility like my husband. I don't want to have to go out with my friends and drink after work every night and get drunk. I'm happy the way things are. Now, I'm not saying all Japanese women think that way, and I'm not saying that that's the way things should be. I'm just saying that if you go to Japan and you look at things from the local level, you might say, if you look at things from the point of view of many Japanese, they may have a different take on it. So, for example, when I was in Japan, I often heard that even though women do not have a lot of official power, they have a lot of domestic power, that they were the ones who controlled the money in the house, in the household. Again, I'm not saying it should be that way. I'm not making an excuse. I'm just saying that we have to at least take into account how subtle the exercise of power can be by the genders, and that sometimes we don't get the whole picture. But I think what you said, my impression is, unfortunately, things are not changing fast enough in Japan when it comes to the role of women.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up, I'm going to have Tom L. And then Regine, you can ask your second question after that. So let's go with Tom. Tom PC.
Oh, hello, Brian. So one of the eye-openers in your presentation was that when Japan fought the Sino-Japanese War, and then the Russo-Japanese War, that were tremendous earthquakes. in terms of the military struggles in that region. And you also mentioned that yes, Japan lived in the shadow of those two great empires, the Middle Kingdom, the Chinese Kingdom, and later the Russian Empire. So I was wondering, what allowed Japan to be this early adopter, to start this early modernization in that region versus any other powers in that geopolitical scheme?
So that's a really excellent question. It's a very big question. And I think there are probably a lot of people have asked that question. I think there are probably several reasons that may not seem very satisfactory. One reason has to do with the fact that Japan's an island, and it's not easy to invade. The other reason has to do with the fact that actually before Japan modernized, and let's say around 1860, they kickstarted their modernization project. For 2 or 3 centuries, actually, the Japanese elite had been absorbing information about Western science. In fact, they used to call it Dutch studies because many of the original texts were written in Dutch from Dutch merchants. And so the Japanese elite always knew that probably eventually they were going to have to open their doors to foreign influences. And so I wouldn't say they were completely ready, but it was not unexpected for them. And they were able to control Japan as a political unit, where in a place like China, I mean, China is vast. And if you look at Chinese history, China was constantly, the central authorities would lose power, then gain power. The boundaries of what the Chinese empire were changing throughout history. It was fragmented. I mean, to this day, China is fragmented between Taiwan and the mainland. So China always faced that problem. And I think the elites, because China was so geographically expansive, the elites really never had a chance to completely control everything going on in China. Where in Japan, even though Japan is bigger than most people think, because it's an island, the authorities, before they started to industrialize even, the shogun kind of had a, not complete control, but they had a fair amount of control of what the populace was up to. And as I said, they actually started to modernize in their own way in the beginning, as early as early 1600s. So even though Japan was a type of semi-feudal monarchy, it's difficult to describe what Japan was. It was, they just used the word a realm because it had elements of feudalism, but in some ways it was centralized. And I think they were able to come up with a balance of how to let the local powers modernize, even before Japan officially started to modernize in the late 19th century.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Ellen, Kevin, Jane, and Rogine. Ellen.
Thank you, Shrikant. Yes, thank you so much. I would like to ask you, Brian, how will education still embrace modernity, but yet carry with it tradition? Is that a question you can address? And thank you.
Yes. Well, yeah, I think that's the big question mark for the Japanese political establishment. How do we modernize? How do we teach our students to be modern, not just Japanese citizens, but to be global citizens? How do we internationalize them while maintaining our Japaneseness? And I think within education, one thing that they focus on is the Japanese language. So of course they have to learn Japanese to read and write, but they also are exposed to Japanese literature, and they make a distinction that in America we don't make when we talk about English. So when I was in school, I learned English, English grammar, English literature, but in Japan they talk about Nihongo, the spoken Japanese language, but they also would speak of Kokugo, and Kokugo means the national language, and I think that's one way that they try to keep. Try to maintain the Japanese identity. And then another way is through what is called moral education. And when I was in Japan, all students had to take that. I think maybe 9 years of it. I'm not sure if they still teach it or how many years, but moral education, it was about being not just a citizen, but about being a Japanese citizen. And actually it had strong Confucianist undertones, and of course Confucianism is I suppose you could argue a part of Japanese identity. So those are just two examples: the Japanese language and also moral education.
A quick follow-up: are there any Japanese classics of literature? If you had to pick like one or two things to get a sense of what Japaneseness is, kind of the foundational work. So what would you recommend?
Well, I think you can go back to the Nara Heian period. That's going back 1,400 years. But then I think the other way is to look at more modern classics. And again, Soseki from the late 19th century. And then after the war, or be right before the war and after the war, you had Japanese writers. I mean, Japanese literature is not really something I know a lot about, but I do know that there certainly are some good writers. I'd have to look into that. I mean, but
no, I was more interested in the kind of classics. So what would be equivalent of I Ching or Dao De Ching of China? What would be the equivalent? Is there any equivalent of that in Japanese, where people like most Japanese would say, yes, that is the foundation, that's one of the foundations of this culture, which is more than like 1,000 years old or something like that. I was looking first. We'll look it up. So we'll, if you pick up something, we'll put it, I'm going to go ahead and put it up on the meetup page. Sure. Thank you. Okay. Next up is Kevin, Jane, and Rogine. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. I know the one you're looking for is called Sendo. I'm going to send you a link later.
Sure.
And my question is about, I would say, during Brian, your presentation, when you mentioned the official late state-guided mobilization, that's so powerful for countries, I got my question is a two-part. What is Germany? You think Germany is like this way too? They recovered so quick. Also, EU, Germany kind of leader of EU, right? However, Japan, I cannot imagine Japan can lead Asia. Second one, how about Indian? You think Indian can learn what Indian as country learn from Japan? Thank you.
So to go back to your first question about Germany, yeah. So Germany, as we know, was a late industrializer, and just like Japan, there was a economic miracle after Germany's defeat after 1945, and so that's why that's why historians typically put Japan and Germany together. And sometimes Italy too, actually. And what they have in common, what Germany, Japan, and Italy have in common is that they were fragmented, right? So throughout the 19th century, there was no Germany, there were just Germanys. And of course, Italy was very much divided. And in a way, before the late 1800s, Japan was divided. I mean, there was a central shogun, a shogunate, but Japan had, in a sense, was feudalistic. It was divided into different domains. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but there are broad historical similarities that we can that I think should be noted. And then with your question about India, I think you asked, what can India learn from Japan? You know, I think sometimes when people look at Japan and they look at how quickly Japan modernized, whether it was in the Meiji era or whether it was after World War II, and they'll say, well, the Japanese modernized because they were able to absorb foreign knowledge so quickly, and they would tinker with it and change it. But basically, that's their secret, that's their trick. But the way I look at it is that's not really what happened. I think the Japanese, of course, did borrow a lot of knowledge from overseas, but it's what they did with it. It's how they organized their society to be receptive to foreign knowledge in such a way that they did not lose their Japanese identity, whatever that is. And so if there's a lesson for India or a lesson for any other country for that matter, it's not about borrowing something. It's not as if there's some secret knowledge from a foreign country that's going to help you modernize. It's what are you going to do with that knowledge once you get it? And so that's maybe not a satisfactory answer, but that's that's how I look at it.
Thank you. Next up is Jane, Jeff, and Regine. Jane. Jane, you need to unmute. Go ahead.
I just unmuted. Thank you. I'm wondering about whether there was a humility amongst the people after World War II, and has that changed?
So I think it depends on what part of the population you're talking about, and it depends on the individual. So yes, I think there was a humility for many Japanese. I don't think all Japanese were happy with the defeat, and you still find remnants of that in the right-wing movement in Japan, where you have extremists. And so there are some Japanese who think that, that Japan should not have been defeated during the war. But I think the vast majority are realize that probably it was a good thing, if I can put it that way, that they were defeated, because the Japanese military dictatorship really, I think it's obvious, did not have the best intentions, not just for Japan's enemies, but for their own people, the way they treated their own people.
Thank you. Next up is Jeff, Claudio, and Regine. Jeff.
Brian, thank you once again for such a remarkable presentation. I really appreciate all that you share with us so generously here. You mentioned, sort of the education regarding national values, and I'm wondering if there are any kind of famous quotes or phrases in Japanese society that would be commonly recognized. Like we have, we hold these truths to be self-evident, or give me liberty or give me death, or, judged by the content of their character, instead of the color of their skin. We have these famous sort of, quotes and phrases in American society. I'm wondering if there are any famous quotes like that.
That's a good question. I have to be honest. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. But I think if there are going to be quotes like that, they're probably going to be from Japan's Confucian tradition, and they're going to be these four, we call them kanji, Chinese character sayings. I mean, when I was in Japan, I used to hear those a lot. But these sayings are actually, they go back thousands of years. They're not, they seem a little bit old-fashioned to us, perhaps. So unfortunately, I can't really give you a good example of that off the top of my head. But that's actually a good question. I'll have to think about that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Next up is Claudio.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering, Brian, how much impact or influence does Hiroshima and Nagasaki have on current Japanese and American relations, if any? If so, which aspect of is it politics, economy, culture, etc.? Which part of Japanese society is most thinks about it the most? You know, is there any? Does it influence the history?
Well, yeah, that's yeah. So when we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, that is a sort of a key aspect of how post-war Japan defined itself as a pacifist nation. And the idea is that we were the only country that was bombed with nuclear weapons. And that gives us a certain, almost it gives us a right to judge other people. And of course, again, it depends who you look at and who you ask. Many, the atomic bombings in Japan really galvanized many Japanese to be pacifist and to be against not just the United States for what it did, but also to be against any country with nuclear weapons, especially at that time in the Cold War, the USSR. So the atomic bombings really are more of a symbol, I think, for many Japanese, whether you're on the right or you're on the left. I mean, the right would say, well, we understand we were at war with the United States, but they played dirty. They went too far by dropping these nuclear bombs on us. Where on the left, the idea is that, well, our own Japanese political leaders got us into this mess, but the Americans should not have dropped those bombs because, again, that was going too far. And this, as I said before, gives the Japanese people what is called pacifist nationalism. It gives us the right to criticize other nations, not just nations that use or have nuclear weapons, but any warmongering nation. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
thank you. Thanks. Next up is Rogine. You had a second question. Go ahead now.
Well, in general, it was about what should we expect from Japan in the future, but we started to get in. I listened to the Center for Digital Life's presentation, and as, if they're correct, as the digital world as a paradigm becomes more important and distinct from the East and the West, will it be much more difficult to retain Japaneseness?
Mm-hmm. My feeling on that's a good question. And my feeling is that technology is neutral and that it comes down to how a people or leadership decides to use a technology. What was the purpose? If anything, I would say that technology, things like social media, digitization, these things are going to reinforce and make Japanese culture stronger. They're going to make Japanese identity stronger. I don't see any reason why they would erode Japanese identity. They might change Japanese identity, but I think that this search for Japanese authenticity is so important in Japan that people will use technology to spread Japanese identity, if you will. In fact, I think a really good example of that is what started to happen back in the 1990s or so, when there was this massive spread of Japanese pop culture all over the globe. I mean, when I grew up, there was no such thing as Japanese pop culture. Pokemon. I mean, no, I was not exposed to any of that when I was a kid. Maybe a Godzilla movie, but that was it. Things are so different now with Japanese pop culture gone global. And it's gone global because of technology. So I think technology, if anything, is going to reinforce not just Japanese identity, but other identities around the world.
Kevin.
Yes, thank you. Brian, I'm curious, during your research, do you have like talk to street on people, let's say beggar, not many beggar maybe, the street people live the poor people, another side of world in Japan. What are your observations? Thank you.
So I think, Kevin, I think you asked about poor people in Japan.
Yeah, minority, let's say people poor, don't forget, the Japanese people, they don't talk, like usually talk to students, hard to open mouth to talk to you from heart. So let's say when you observe from street, let's say it's the majority still live, right? Not like rich people, like those elite.
Okay. So
let me go ahead and rephrase. Let me try to put it. It's difficult. So the question is, in Japanese society, are there poor people, and how do they work? How do people treat them? What's the deal with that?
Okay. Yes, that's actually a very good question, because that's this image we have that there is no poverty in Japan, and that's a myth. I used to hear that all the time, that the vast majority of Japanese are middle class. And actually, the myth of the middle class is not just a Japanese myth. That's sort of a modern idea that we're all middle class, or we're going to be middle class, or we should be middle class. The truth is, in Japan, you do have poverty, but it's articulated differently than it is, at least in America. And I don't want to speak too much about Europe, but I mean, for example, I know in Great Britain, class differences based on economics and culture, people are proud of those differences. I'm not saying they enjoy being poor. Whereas in Japan, being poor is something that you're not supposed to talk about, and you're not supposed to wear it. So, it's very easy in certain societies to walk down a street and look at somebody and tell how they, by the way they dress and the way they talk, what economic class they come from. I mean, not always, I'm exaggerating. So I want to be careful. But in Japan, it's not that easy on the street to tell who's poor or not. I mean, if you look closely, maybe you can tell. I'm just saying that there's this image that there's not poverty in Japan, when in fact there is. It's just not articulated the same way as it is in other societies. That's an important point, actually.
I kind of share one story, Yuanka, you want to me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. What's that? Sorry, Kevin, you were saying.
I kind of share one story learned from the TV, YouTube, actually.
No. Let's keep on the topic. We're almost coming to the end here.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's. So, Brian, you spent 17, 18 years in Japan. What do you miss most about Japan?
I miss, well, this is very personal, but I miss efficiency. I miss people doing what they said they're going to do. So I could count on one hand how many times Japanese got my order wrong at a fast food restaurant or screwed up at the bank. I miss that. I don't know what things are like in Japan now. This is because I haven't been back to Japan in a while. But when I was there, things worked, people worked. When I came back to the United States in 2003, I was shocked at how things don't work, and how it seemed many times people would get things wrong. And I had to spend a lot of time calling people back to fix things. The other thing I miss is civility and politeness. And again, that's kind of a myth that Japanese are polite, but there's a lot of truth to that. And it comes from this moral education. That's something they're taught in school, how to speak properly to people, how to be polite to people, how to let people talk before you jump to a conclusion. And civility, I think it's not just not just about social nicety in Japan. Civility is really what upholds their society. And I think that in America, again, this is just my personal opinion, very biased. I think we used to actually have more of that decades ago, but I think something's been lost the past 30, 40 years. Maybe it has to do with social media. I don't know. We have forgot the importance of everyday manners and civility. So that's a very personal view.
I'll ask it from another perspective. What does Japan have to offer the world? So, for example, anime is a clear example of, it's like a major Japanese idea kind of taken to kind of a level of perfection, which is kind of swept across. So what do you think Japan as a culture, because now we're talking not only about the current Japan, right, but the entire Japanese culture. So what does Japanese culture have to offer to the world?
Yeah, that's a big question. And again, I don't want to idealize Japan because there are certain things that I think Japan has problems with. But from a more positive angle, I think, as strange as this sounds, egalitarianism. That they have an economic system, even though they have poor people, it seems, for example, their tax system seemed more fair than the American. It seemed more simplified. Again, I don't know if that's still true, but it just seemed like despite the hierarchy in Japan, there was this idea in Japan that we're all in this together as Japanese, a sort of positive, beneficial type of nationhood. And sometimes they would go too far, but the idea is not to look for reasons to fragment society. And I think we see that, at least in the United States more recently. Look, people want to fragment, balkanize our society. Where in Japan, the idea is that we're all Japanese, we're all citizens. I think also I admire how they could balance tradition with modern technologies, and how, as I said before, they would use modern technologies to bring things back from the past to reinforce what it means to be Japanese. So again, there's things I certainly disagree, certain things I don't like about Japan, but I think the one to kind of summarize this, Japan was faced with the challenge of how to rebuild after the war without killing each other. How can we do that without squabbling and pointing fingers? And it's an overused word in Japan. It's kind of a myth, but this idea of consensus, that there's always going to be something we can build upon, something we can agree on. And that's, the sort of positive view of human nature, this constant search for consensus. I think that's something that I think Japan has a lot to offer the world.
Wonderful. One last question. Demographically, Japan is one of the countries which is getting older the fastest. And it is projected that by 2050, the median age is going to cross like 65 or something like that. So do you think Japan will be able to handle it well? How does it handle this demographic issue of shrinking population and increasing median age?
Right. So a lot of people bring that up about Japan, that this is one of the big challenges Japan is facing. When I was there back in the 90s, people were always talking about it. I'm not sure. I don't think the problem has gotten better. And of course, the two answers that people would come up with to fix this problem would be more immigrants, legal immigration, which is actually, that's one thing I don't like about Japan. They're not as open as I think other modern national states should be, not just to immigrants, but also to refugees. And so, you know, the question is, are they going to open the doors to more immigrants to help with this population problem? And then, of course, the other thing you always hear is, technology, that we're going to design these robots, you know, these for old people, these robotic pets, and are going to be able to make people feel better in nursing homes and things like that. You know, and I don't really know, of course, how true that's going to be. I mean, they might be able to use technology to overcome this shrinking population. But, you know, there's grave economic challenges, because if you don't have enough people working, you're not going to have the tax revenue. You're not going to be able to generate the surplus wealth you need to lead a comfortable modern life. So in any case, I think we're going to have to wait. I think we're probably going to get an answer in another decade or so to see if the Japanese really are up to the challenge. Wonderful. All right, Brian, thank you very much. And folks, we are going to return back to Julian Jaynes from next week, and I'll be talking to Brian, and we'll figure out some program, because we have established the core ideas of Julian Jaynes, and we want to now kind of take the conversation forward. So that's what we're going to do starting next Saturday. So thank you very much, Brian. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Very, very good questions. Appreciate it. Bye now. Bye.